this will have to be part 2. A man just came in because I'm in a public space, so I don't even have a private space where I can do the video now. Such is the interesting experience of being without your own space. And what I feel is that public space is shrinking because of the privatisation ideology that's imbued within government now, and the increasing influence of corporations who don't understand the social implications of purely market economics. I'm trained as an economist. I know that the market dictates on the basis of supply and demand, on the basis of price to maximise profit so that people's self-interest is maximised. It doesn't sit with social policy or social services, which requires a fixed investment grant, whatever you want to call it, to enable those services to be provided without a profit motive. And as I was saying, my conscientious objection with Centrelink is because I was denied my rights to say no to activities that I didn't believe would give me work. You know, I've been around. I'm not naive. I'm not a new early entrant into the job market. And it's the problem too with job providers, they're dealing with jobs that are really casualised. These are not permanent professional jobs. So I'm not even in the right area to get work for me. So clearly I'm not going to get work. If I'm applying for a secretary when I've got a business degree, they're not going to employ me. Or if they did, they would be getting all these skills for what, $17 an hour? I mean, that's a joke. I was paid $20 an hour in the 1980s. So you can see my dilemma. They also were asking me to work for the dole to produce Christmas cards, which I just thought was more akin to slave labour. I've been to bonded labour camps in India. I recognise that when you withdraw a person's right to say no, you're actually engaging in a form of slavery, which we've signed conventions off here in Australia. So we're even breaching our own international obligations. They get you to sign a job sort of plan, which you can't say no to, and they stipulate the activities. You have to come in every fortnight for 2 hours to be supervised. I mean, how insulting is that? I don't need supervision for a job search, but I recognise later the reason they did that was to prove that they had engagement with you so they can get paid. So it's got nothing to do with you. So I have to rearrange my day because clearly I've got nothing better to do, to sit in a job agency every fortnight for a few hours so they can say to the government that they've done something with me. So they get paid, and that then becomes about their needs, not mine. If they don't have expertise, which many of them certainly wouldn't have market research backgrounds where they know how to engage with the research sector so I can get work, they wouldn't. They would be dealing with blue-collar or white-collar, low-level jobs where they even stipulated to me on a few occasions they wouldn't tell me who the company was. They just named the job, and they basically were trying to force me to put my application in. I don't want to necessarily work for anyone. I want to make sure they're non-abusive cultures because I've come out of quite a lot of trauma, even in my working life, where I've been overworked, underpaid, no real quick career progression. I've had gender issues too. I want determination over my life. So when that's taken from me, I'm not in a democratic society. Now, when I was evicted and I became homeless, I ended up spending time with family, which is not easy for me because they're very strong-minded people. And we clash. So that's not a place I can go, really. I ended up heading up north. Before I was cut off Centrelink, I did have the money to travel up north. And I was looking for work, but I also went on a mental health plan because I wanted to end my life quite a number of times, and I don't have mental health issues, as you can see. I'm still exactly the same as I was back then. But I was coming out of a conflict with the university over many, many years where I wasn't heard. I'd written endless amounts of emails to them, which they can turn around and say that's a form of harassment. It wasn't. I was very polite, and it wasn't a battery of emails. It was a conflict that was unresolved. I'm trained in mediation. And essentially I was trying to put my case because I didn't feel I was understood for a long time. You know, the issue was a subtle sexual harassment issue, but I was more than willing to sit down and resolve the matter with the person. But they wouldn't allow that. They ignored me for a very long time. He had a complaint, but his complaint was taken on board, but not mine. My need to be heard and my need to resolve the conflict was completely ignored, even though the risk manager at the time had said that they had a policy of first step was mediation, which I'm trained in. So this is not about any form of harassment. It was about my needs not being met. And I've come to see even today in conflict with my family that I'm not heard. And it's all about the other party, they're not really understanding your needs. And I would say equally, to be fair to everybody, I agree we've got to slow down and hear each other. I'm all for that. When I was a researcher, I used to have focus groups, and that's all about hearing all the people in the room equally. And I really loved it because it was a form of democracy I really embraced. But when you're dealing with a society that's not trained in this area, and I can teach it, but I can't seem to get traction. I'm probably not so good at it with my own family because they're my family, and often what happens with families is we've got our own cultures that we've grown up in, and we all just slip back into modes of communication that are not necessarily healthy modes. We bring up issues from the past because we're all unresolved. We're not necessarily understanding the importance of respect and what it is to really deeply listen. And I know the Indigenous understand that because that's imbued in their philosophies, to deeply listen. Not to speak, but to actually hear the other party, because everyone's crying out to be heard. Now, the homeless people I've come across, they're coming out of trauma. These traumas are coming from unresolved conflict. We are not very sophisticated emotionally. We call it in conflict resolution emotional intelligence. In other words, we're not dealing with our feelings. One person said to me today, it's best to suppress it all for the sake of peace, and that was seen as not being selfish, and that to ask to be heard was somehow all about you, but it's not. It's about sharing perspectives that may differ. It's about how do we work together as a group, because we're not going solo here. We're in the same space together, and we've got to learn how to collaborate, how to work together given our differences. And the same applies at the international level, where we're seeing all these disputation taking place with the United States, with Russia, with China. These endless wars that continue on because if we never resolve the problem, we end up escalating the tensions because of surveillance, because we distrust the other parties, because we don't come across the floor, because there's vested interests. We want to continue making all the money. We don't want to share it. And these are the conversations that really, I guess, are reflective at the microcosm, and then they play out at the macrocosm when people are in positions of power and leadership. And the same applies with large institutions or organisations where they are in their ivory towers, and that's why those ivory towers were categorised as such, is because they were not willing to hear. There's also gender dynamics. Women such as myself are very good at communicating, but we're often confronted with those who aren't so good at it, and they want to shut it down rather than open it up because that's not their culture. And so from a feminine perspective, we end up being said, we're being told, if you like, that we talk too much, that we're the problem because people aren't willing to face their own issues. So denial comes in, and we don't often know we're in denial. We just know that we want to avoid that subject, shut it down, and we have patterns of thought that are unquestioned. I've often talked about Byron Katie and the work. She is a person who awakened. She was depressed for 10 years, and she literally had a spiritual experience where she woke up. Now, what she realised was everything was connected. her past disappeared, and so she stepped into the unknown completely. And it was an awakening in that there was no fear in the space where she found herself, no fear at all. And she was filled with love and joy. She sat in the desert apparently she did the 40 days in the desert and had tears pouring down her face in a state of joy. She would walk not knowing where she was going. She was able to be in complete uncertainty, but in complete trust of this higher power, she would call it. Anyway, she said the work was born inside her when she awakened, and the work is very simple. It's 5 questions. So you have a negative thought that you're thinking. The first question is it true? The second question is, can you be absolutely sure that it's true? The third question is, how do you feel, how do you react when you believe the thought? The fourth question is, can you just suspend the thought and look at the issue, look at the people involved without the story running? And then the next part is what she calls the turnarounds, where you turn it around to the self, the other, and the opposite. So if we come to a point of realizing that everything is projection, now the way that projection is described is it's like a movie theatre. So the life we're looking at out there is a projected reality. Now that means that our brain is projecting onto that reality good, bad, lovely, whatever emotional feelings we're having, we're projecting onto it. So the brain becomes, if you like, the camera projecting onto the screen, which is life, would be how projection is best described. All of us do it. I do it. I have my own narratives, my own story as well, and then I might fall into judgment on something. But the work of peace is really to become more quiet and more present with self. It is also about questioning our thinking. And that questioning is simply trying on another way of seeing, well, is it true what I think? Even though I believe this is an absolute truth and they are wrong and I am right. And this is where our divisions come from, this polarity. I know you don't, or I presume and you don't know anything. And this is where the powerlessness arises in people. This is why when people feel powerless, they start to speak up. They try to be heard. They could continue, if someone goes silent, they could continue to talk to that person because they're feeling they're not heard. And yet that could be turned around in an adversarial conflict and called harassment, when the intention really is, I'm not being heard and your silence is creating the space where I feel powerless. And if that other who was being silent recognised that their behaviour was actually creating the communication, co-creating it is what would be more accurate. This is 2 parties in this. Then they might then even send a message to that person and say, look, I do hear you, but I don't want to talk about it. I can't talk about it. Or let's sit down and talk about it. Let's get in a third-party mediator, someone who can help us to hear each other, because that's what conflict resolution is about. It's about giving people a space where they're respected. That equalises the power. Now, that equality is what creates stability in the world. I call it homeostasis. Equality, fairness, is all about rebalancing what's out of whack. Now, when it's out of whack, this is why people keep trying to be heard, they keep trying to protest, they keep trying to write letters, they write reports, whatever, because there's no corresponding response. And I would say throughout the many, many years I've had these challenges happening in my life, that would be the most consistent theme, is not being responded to appropriately, not being directly answered. My grievances definitely left unaddressed. And my sense of equality completely eroded, as if I have no right to speak. I am a poet, thank goodness, and through poetry I've been able to save my life, actually, because I wrote poetry to get to the truth of matters because I couldn't get it from other people. And this includes senior management who use adversarial and aggressive approaches to deal with conflict, which come out of risk management, which is all about protecting the assets of that organisation. It's not about resolving the conflict for peace and harmony. That comes out of security type training, it comes out of policing, it comes out of compliance. So when you look at occupational health and safety, much of this is coming out of a compliance type framework. People do not understand the democracy in which we say we live. Most don't live it, most mouth it, but if they were truly serious about democracy, they would be actively creating forums, they would be actively getting the voice of the people heard. We wouldn't be so closed out of areas that actually impact us. For example, with Centrelink, from my perspective, I was told that I was not in equal partnership. And this was when I was en route up to Queensland trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I was homeless at the time, and then they were trying to impose edicts on me that I have to go to populated areas. Well, I'm homeless, I'm going to look for shelter. So clearly they're out of alignment with the reality on the ground. There was no compassion about me when I got cut off. It was ruthless. And I believe it came out of an ideological perspective that saw me as left-wing. Because I'm into peace. I'm not left-wing, and I've made that very clear in my blogs and videos. I'm not left-wing, right-wing, or any wing. I'm just a human being who's following her own heart. I dreamed I was teaching peace. Peace is not an anti-government thing from my perspective. It's really about finding true harmony within oneself and going out into the world and giving it. When I was a clown, that's precisely what I did. It was gave love and laughter and humour to thousands and thousands of people, not just here in Australia, but all over the world. And what I was really doing was revaluing them as people. I saw everyone as equal, and this is not a lie, this is true, because I was coming out of love for everyone. People can say, oh, that's very, very airy. It's not. When you truly love people, you will see them for who they are. And you'll be much more forgiving and compassionate, and you won't leave them out in the street freezing to death like they are here in Canberra. I've already been told about people sleeping in the alleyways, and it's absolutely freezing. It was -5 last night. It's not acceptable. So my peace work was about revaluing everyone. I'll try not to get emotional, but I really feel intense about this. I did my best and my part. I wasn't paid, by the way, and I don't see anyone jumping up and down by the fact that I wasn't paid to give love and humour and entertainment to people. They'll say, oh, well, that was your choice. Well, I've come at life from a perspective of humanity. I'm a world server. I'm not a business person. I've worked in business. I ran my own research company for 6 years. I'm not a business person. I'm not going to go out and market to people because I don't like the falseness of it. And when I tried to re-engage in producing workshops, I just can't take on the professional acumen anymore. I've become too authentic in myself, and it won't work in business. Because you have to present professionally, you have to have the professional website, you have to speak the language, and I no longer speak that language. You know, when I went out and clowned around the world, and when I wrote poetry, it changed my life and it changed me. I just want to be real in my life, and I want to tell the truth. I want to heal the past. It's very tough when people are not willing, but I understand most people are wounded. So you can't just sit there and cast aspersions over the homeless and say, look at those poor people. Everyone is homeless to a certain degree. In their own homes, they're homeless. The partner's not hearing them. The partner's just sitting there. Or they're being badgered by a wife, or, you know, who's not listening but too busy, you know, asserting her perspective, not understanding it. She's got to also learn to respect that difference. So what we're essentially not doing is respecting the differences amongst us, and we're certainly not making any movement towards healing it or resolving it. Now, I've dealt with regulators as well. I'm not going to list out who they all are. They know, if they get to see this video, they know who they are. But what I found with the regulators, they've all been watered down. They've been cut in respect of funding. Now, we saw what happened with the building industry in respect of regulations not being properly supervised, and that comes from cuts to regulators. Now, it's all very well to say the market is more efficient than government. I would say to you, as a person who's been both in the market and also trained in economics, The greed in the market-based system is really problematic. The need for control, we have hierarchical structures. They're not democratic at all. So industrial democracy never happened. And therefore people get used to being dictating to others and expecting those others to comply. We have not enshrined within our society and our commercial sector the very democratic principles that this society has been shaped on, which is freedom of speech, which is if something impacts you, have a right to say something about it. The right to protest is not anti-government. It's releasing, this is what we say in peace studies, it's actually a safety valve. It's very essential for the good functioning of governance and society. People need to be able to protest. They don't want cameras recording their every move. We do not want internal surveillance through our computers. I know I don't, and I've already been the subject of surveillance and still am. In the first instance, surveillance happened to me because I was on radio and I was interviewing people engaged in peace. It could be political, it could be economic, it could be someone who's just done an initiative to create peace in their society. It could be mediators. I spoke with international relations experts. I've spoken with ex-spies. I've spoken with, you know, practitioners in the peace education area. These were academics. I've spoken with Fulbright scholars talking about human rights. I've spoken with lawyers, and the list goes on. The whole purpose of my program, Bridges to Peace, was literally that, to create a bridge here. This is not about anti-anything, even though, yes, people have gotten very angry with government because they see human rights abuses and they're hurt. They're in pain when they see other humans being hurt. That's a natural human reaction. But when we're dealing with projections of power, not democratic interface here, we find ourselves dealing with forms of suppression, which is not democratic. They come in very subtly. They might come through intimidation. They might come through standard letters. You might not be answered. But we do not resolve conflict, which is really about different perspectives clashing it up. We do not want those different perspectives to disintegrate into violence. Violence is a call for help because people can't cope. We don't want them being indoctrinated in violent video games as children, believing that that's how you resolve disputes, that you get a gun and you shoot at it. Now, that might well serve recruitment for the military, but it doesn't serve us, we the people, at all. Because as we can see through the shooter issues in the United States, that society is absolutely saturated with violent images. We in Australia are getting the same thing. So inevitably someone is going to either get onto ice or something or lose the plot. They might crack and then they go for a gun. We don't want that. We want to see people learning from conflict. We want it to be non-violent. We want people to actually respond to that other party and stop vilifying them. What I learned in my experience was when I chose to keep speaking up, and I did it very politely. I've never said one negative word to anyone, but I have persevered because I recognise there's a problem here. These were walls that I came up against. What I encountered was legal matters arising out of my problem, where I was very willing to mediate prior to the legal situation. I had an intervention order situation where I was guilty before being proven innocent. Allegations that were inaccurate and incorrect and fallacious. And what I came to understand was that's to put me on the defensive. It wasn't about resolving the problem, it was about silencing me. And that to me is a police state, which Andrew Wilkie, the MP in Tasmania, has been talking about. He's been coming out on Get Up, which is the activist group. And he's been saying that he has real concerns. He was the one who was the whistleblower from the Office of National Assessment in respect of Australia going to war in Iraq. He was assessing the situation in Iraq, and he said there was no threat to our country. Yet we had a Prime Minister at that stage who was very much on the bandwagon, because from a Conservative perspective, he was aligned with the United States Conservative Party or Republicans. So we got party politics traversing countries, and we have influences here in Australia. Now, what do we do about that when the allegiances are not necessary to the voice of the people? And this is the same issue coming out of the United States public and the UK public. All over the world, people are looking at their leadership and they're going, you are not hearing us and you're not working for us. So that issue that I've expressed in my life experience of vilification, bullying, covert bullying, I'm trained in anti-bullying, has come out of this sort of repressive type approach to conflict, which is about projections of power. It's not about respect, which is why even in the sexual harassment area, there's a lot of discussion around respect, what that means. The Me Too movement is not some fanciful notion of women who are burning their bras or anything like that. The Me Too movement's come out of women recognising that they're not in equal status to men still. Yes, they are moving and progressing through the ranks, but by and large, there are unquestioned attitudes towards females who are seen as less on some level. There's boys' clubs that relate to one another, but they don't relate to the females, or they don't understand them, or vice versa, the females are not understanding them. So we've got misunderstandings occurring here. And so it develops into a movement. That's what happens. The movements are coming out of long-term grievances. They're not just suddenly organised on Twitter or social media. They're coming out because people are so frustrated and they don't feel heard. And then we have weak regulators who aren't able to resolve the conflicts, and so they either escalate, or the person suicides, or they let it go. And they become disempowered, and they sink into the mass of society who all feel powerless. And that's where the grounds for violence, domestic violence, that's where the seeds are sown. It's no mistake that domestic violence or violence against women is the major area of incarceration or jail in the country. The disputation is coming at that level because those males are feeling disempowered and they're getting frustrated with their own partners because they're suppressed at work. So we're not in healthy, robust cultures that are inclusive, that resolve conflict through dialogue, that rebalance those power dynamics, those power imbalances. We also have judicial frameworks of status that's imbued within those who are presiding over those proceedings. And we don't know to what extent those judges are neutral. I certainly have encountered non-neutrality, and I was told by the Attorney General's Department quite a few years ago that judges are neutral. They're not, in my experience. And I have written a report to the Judicial Commission. I've explained exactly where the problems were, and my complaint was rejected after 7 months. I took it to the Broad-Based Commission Against Corruption because I saw that as highly problematic, and they wouldn't even accept my complaint, citing lack of resources. That's not good enough in a democratic system. And this again escalates the conflict. I've just spent a day in Parliament. I'm here in Canberra, so I found out that there was an inquiry into the intelligence community and media or press freedom. I've been on radio, and in fact that surveillance that happened to me was when I was on radio interviewing whistleblowers. Major Douglas Rockey, who was a senior, he was director of the depleted uranium project in the Pentagon, and I also interviewed Scott Ritter, who was senior weapons inspector in Iraq, ex-CIA, amongst many others that I listed before. Now, I was innocent when I recorded these interviews. I had no idea of the intelligence apparatus that was in the background. I had no clue. I was very innocent. And in a lot of ways, I mean, I'm learning as I go because I'm trying to solve my problem. But I've had to confront that because I had evidence of who was surveilling me on my phone. It was a foreign country, the United States. And I realised later there's a Five Eyes network where they share data. So I don't know if they are surveilling me on behalf of my own country. I don't know, because they're not allowed to surveil their civilian citizens. We've also got the problem with our voices being recorded, our IDs being checked. These are all signs of totalitarian states. And if I get arrested for this, that's okay. At least I get accommodation. I am not for a totalitarian control state, and those who don't comply get cut off the system, like I've been cut off. I believe we have to resolve disputation. I do not believe dominance is going to bring those other parties peace either. I believe it's going to create more and more distrust in the world, because there's other governments around the world who are also totalitarian, who don't have any respect for, you know, sharing power with others, because their insecurity is unquestioned. And this has been an old paradigm that's been going on since time immemorial, but it's cost us over $1 trillion a year in armaments, because we're not able to resolve interpersonal, international conflict. It all comes right back down to the very first principles of values. I call them universal values. Now, in my work, I produced the Real Hope program, which is an acronym for responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and service. This was taught to primary school children. I did it as a clown because I was trying to create a loving classroom. I taught the children conflict resolution. I taught them about discriminations. I had them in a circle and I said, let's say you have a bike. Let's say that you're with someone here who you consider your enemy. Would you lend your bike? If they were your friend, would you lend your bike? If they were a stranger, would you lend your bike? So the children could then get a feeling for how they discriminate. I also practiced Jane Elliott's work, which is a well worth source. She is the very famous Texan educator who's herself been confronted with a lot of vilification down in the South, Texas. She created the Blue Eyed, Brown Eyes series, where she divided her primary school class into brown eyes and blue eyes. Now, the brown eyes in one scenario were inferior, blue eyes were superior, and then what she did was she vilified them. She put them down. She said that the brown-eyed were inferior, they've come from Africa or whatever. She just used discriminatory terms. The blue-eyed were superior, look at them. They're obviously wealthy, they've done well. And she just worked on it. Now, she did tests on the kids, and what happened was the kids who thought they were superior did better. What does that tell us? The kids who were put down, disempowered, made to feel as if they'll never amount to anything, did poorly. What does that tell us? I did it with the children on the basis of blue-eyed children can be clowns, brown-eyed children can't. This is brown and green-eyed. I made them sit to the side while they watched us play Chinese whispers and experiential learning of what it is to be discriminated against. Then I got them all together and I said, how does it feel to be the inside group, the privileged group, the higher class? How does it feel to be the outside group, the lower class, the inferior, the inadequate, whatever label you want to apply? Well, they didn't like it. And then I said, well, okay, now you've all heard each other speak and how it felt to be privileged and how it feels to be excluded, included. What are you going to do in the playground? How are you going to treat the disabled child? How are you going to treat the child who's from Sudan? How are you going to treat the little girl who's by herself? What if the person's fat? You know, etc., etc. This extrapolates out to the greater society when they grow up. How are they going to treat other people? How are you going to treat the homeless? You're going to let them sleep in alleys and freeze? Are you going to let them suicide quietly? Or are we as a society, instead of building all these brand new high-rise buildings, 1,200 on the other side of town, this is accommodation. You're going to house them first, is what you'll do. And that's what values teach. That's what I tried to teach, but I couldn't get a foothold into schools. I also taught empathy, stand in someone else's shoes. How does it feel to be that other person? It's not all about you. And yet others can look at you and say, you think it's all about you. No, I'm not. I'm simply trying to say to you there's another perspective here. How do we teach that empathy? Well, we teach it by mixing children up. We don't put them on iPads and disconnect them through technology. You're asking for a future world where there is going to be no consideration for others. There's going to be no reaching a hand out if they're in trouble. What happens when the climate completely collapses here? We've got an economic recession, they say, coming. It's definitely here already. There's a mad rush to bring all the IT online, all the sensor technology, the Internet of Things, etc. And yet those social issues are left to the side as if irrelevant. It's like female work. It's not. It's social work. That label was given to social workers for a reason. Until we get it right within us, we cannot create so-called livable cities. They are not smart, intelligent, emotionally intelligent cities. These are cities for those who have the money to afford it, and the price they pay for that interconnectivity is a loss of privacy. These are social issues that have to be discussed. You don't just roll out all this infrastructure without proper consultation of the public. Now, I mentioned earlier that I went to Parliament to listen to the Senate inquiry on the intelligence community and really press freedom. I would expand that inquiry to say public media as well, so community radio. We also need protections because we're more vulnerable in that we're not even trained as journalists. We can easily make mistakes. We can easily have defamation levelled, when what we're really trying to do is talk about the issues that matter to people in that community. The mainstream media tend to be more regionalised now as they concentrate media ownership. The community radio is coming out of the community, and it's speaking the language the community want to hear in language they understand. When I was in that Senate hearing, I'm trained, I'm educated, I understand what they're talking about. I was thinking about public sitting in on that session who wouldn't have a clue what they're talking about. Now, you can listen to narratives. We had the police, we had ASIO, we had the Ombudsman, Home Affairs, various other representatives giving their perspective. The argument for the justification for these raids on, like, the ABC and News Limited or News Corp was that the journalists can't possibly know the implications of information they release to the public, and it might seem okay on the surface, but there may well be information that they don't recognise but the other side or the enemy does. And this is an adversarial mindset that's coming out of the military, because most of those players in the AF, the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, Home Affairs have come probably, highly likely, from military backgrounds. I worked for the police myself. I met those who had been primarily or previously in military areas. I've also worked with security type people who often come out of the police or the military. So they're trained in adversarial mindsets where they are trained to see an enemy. They also suppress their emotions. Now, this is the disconnect emotionally from a social point of view, where we're in a community here. We're dealing with mindsets that believe the greatest security to that country is in its defence. This is a Hobbesian worldview. I recommend you look up Hobbesian. Libertarian, Lockean perspective is a more libertarian, international law perspective. The Hobbesian is it's a world of tooth and claw, dog eat dog. Now, for some men that might be the case. For myself as a woman, I believe we can dialogue. I've been to conflict zones with Rotary. I have looked at the killing fields and I've seen what the outcome of totalitarian regimes, what they do to people. I've seen the torture chambers. I cried. I've seen the result of the Vietnam War, which actually flowed into Cambodia and set the conditions for totalitarianism to arise. Thousands and thousands, if not millions, were died through starvation. There was also this inequality that happened in Cambodia. The bourgeoisie, the ones that were considered educated, were the ones that were killed off. I saw many, many photos when I went into Torsalong prison, which was a converted high school. I actually went to the killing fields and saw all the skulls. And this all came out of Pol Pot, who'd studied in France, who'd taken on an ideological perception that he wanted to flatten that society. He believed, he projected onto that society his beliefs. They were actually very happy, harmonious. In Asia, the peoples are very humble, very beautiful people. And then they were put through brutality that was just horrendous for them all. And I've had the experience of seeing that on the ground. I've known soldiers very intimately who didn't shoot the other party, who actually shot over their heads because they saw their mother's faces in their faces. That was the humanity connecting to the other, and that person could not kill. In the film Men That Stare at Goats, the commander of that unit, when they first dropped them into Vietnam, said that all new recruits couldn't shoot the other party. They shot over their heads because it's not in human nature to kill another. We're actually more programmed into saving each other. That's why all the war images are of heroism, of saving people. We're not promoting the fact that they killed 100 people. There's none of that in the Anzac narrative. It's always been about Simpson and his donkey. It's about the saving of life. So what does that tell us about what is respected here? It's in the saving of human life. So these security apparatuses that have come out of the military are in conflict with the press, the media, the community media, myself as a person who's independently reported and brought out whistleblower stories where they were alleging illegal wars in places like Iraq, where contractors came in there and made a lot of money, and they were also embedded within government. Halliburton being a case in point. What do we do about the infiltration of our governments by either wealthy individuals, corporate entities who have this revolving door through lobbyists inside and outside of government? How does that reflect the Australian people, the American people, the British people, the Thai people, the Japanese people, the Russian people, the Nepali people, Inuit, whoever you want to put in that same ring is the same deal. The words terrorism keep coming up. Well, there's more information coming out that there has been funding going on around that. And I won't bring that up, but let's just say it's not necessarily what we think. And there are investments that people benefit from endless wars. Do we want that? Is it going to be an endless war to the end? Or do we put all those resources in excess of $1 trillion per year into social stability, into water, clean water, cleaning up the atmosphere, climate change, instead of all this weaponry? Can we not redirect even 10% of that back into social areas? So the very tensions that cause disputation in the world disappear. That is if we want that to happen. In my experience through the conflicts I've been through, I'm not dealing with people who want to resolve the conflict. I'm dealing with people who want to expand their power and control. And that I see as the essential problem. That is why there is homelessness. That is why there are people ending their lives as we speak. That is why there are people trying to rebuild their lives after their whole community has been destroyed, because of the machinations of a few people at the top who will not resolve the conflict, who believe that power comes from the acquisition of assets, the accumulation of money, small percentages in the world population owning in excess of 50% of the world's wealth. Is that going to create equity? Are those views going to be disproportionately pushed out onto the world, where the mainstream population of billions has no say? I mean, what sort of civilizations are we going to become here? And it breaks my heart to see where we are in 2019. It seems like we've not come far at all. I don't particularly understand why no one really cares about the homeless. I don't understand that at all. What if it was you? Would you want someone to help you? Of course you would. and why people keep on these treadmills and they don't question what's going on around them. They say they have no power. Well, you do have power. I took myself to university. I had a year 10 education. I took myself into year 11 and 12 in 1 year. I then funded myself through university. No one paid for me. And I educated myself in peace studies, in conflict resolution, alternatives to violence. I did a lot of work, travelled the world to try and understand my planet. I went to 20 countries. I did that to understand all the people. I clowned on the streets with diverse people from me. I was in Egypt on the street. I got to hug the people. Juggled on a train platform there. I was in Thailand, in Bangkok, and I went on the train as a clown. And I blew up a balloon and I bounced it around and people kept tapping it and they laughed and they connected with each other. They weren't all plugged in. We are at a precipice, I think, of great change. To go back to the inquiry, I think there has to be a complete rethink on what real security means. This whole cyber thing is way out of hand. You have to build bridges to the other parties. You have to know something about their culture. Scott Ritter was the one who talked about the importance of knowing the other culture rather than trying to force one's values onto them. We have to learn what respect really means. And can you sit in the room with someone who's completely different from you without wanting to hurt them? Can you sit with that one who may not like you and be an example in that room to that other party so they respect you? Can you go back over your policies and think again, will this serve not only the community interest, the public interest, but what sort of outcome is really going to come out of this? Is it just going to be an escalation? How do we reach that other to stop World War III? Do we keep suppressing our people? What happens when innocent people go to jail? In their privatised jails, what happens when they all have to work in that jail and they're not paid? Same exploitation happens, is what I encountered with the work for the dollar situation. This is exploitation. This is not sophisticated democratic fairness. Why do we have to be punished? Why can't we be enlightened? If we have harmed another, then enlighten us to what we've done. I don't have a problem with community service whatsoever. Very happy to help another. I don't have a problem with saying I'm wrong. I don't have a problem with saying sorry. I don't even have a problem with not having much money. I'm okay with that because I don't want a lot. I'm not greedy for more and more. I want to know myself and be true. That's why I wrote Real Hope. That's why I created a Children's Circle Parliament so that it was non-adversarial. It's not like Question Time, but everybody comes to solve the same problem. I think we all have to come together in forums and actually solve these global issues. We have to rebalance power so that it's fair. It's not a projection of power, but it's a truly democratic world order. You can't keep using these words and not living them. We have to have a world that's fit for children, that when they grow up, they're not all going to be monitored from the cradle to the grave, profiled, watched everywhere they go in this Brave New World scenario. I feel uncomfortable when I see cameras. No one's asked me if I want to be watched and recorded. I don't want to be watched and recorded. I'm very happy to come to you and tell the truth to you because they're my values. But I don't want my phone tapped. I don't want someone coming and hacking onto my computer. I don't want people gathering up all my blog entries on Peace is Our True Nature so that they can profile me further or find something wrong with me. I would want them to look at that information as a perspective that might be of service to them. I don't want to be excluded from work because I'm 54. I want to participate. I want to be involved. I want to teach my work. I want to get people laughing. I want them healing. I want to teach conflict resolution and peace education. These are the things I want to do if you're asking me. I don't want to go and work in a shop because I see the world on a precipice of great change and I don't want to waste 1 minute involved in activities that are not serving my society. And that's where I'm at. And that's what I've learned. It's not about spying on each other, it's about learning and understanding one another. It's not about getting rid of what's different, it's about embracing that difference because you are me. It's about growing, not controlling the world in your image. That's playing God. What if the world was coming to you, for you? What if what you resist persists and what you look at disappears? What if what you think about, you bring about? So if you keep going on about terrorism, guess what? That might profit a few, but it's not going to create a stable planet. What about all the animals on the planet? What about the system that's been in place for 4 billion years being destroyed? And we be the last generation that's done it. We become the 6th extinction event. Is that what we really want? You might say, oh, well, it's inevitable. No, it's not. We can turn it around. But we need inspired and strong leaders who have very strong principles and values that don't get chewed up by the courts, but are actually supported to bring in a vision of egalitarianism as a truism that can lead by example and teach dialogue by their own actions, that are open to the other side, don't see them as an enemy but as an opportunity. What if there is the real poverty existing in our lack of generosity and our judgments of each other? Maybe that's the real poverty. What if there's enough for everybody when we actually share and care, reveal and heal? That's what love is. So this offering I've put to you is another perspective that I send with you always with love, and my honesty is coming out of a deep desire to solve a problem. And that we in the public are definitely aware of what's going on and we're very concerned. We don't want any more marketing spin by those in power. We want real conversations. And we need to be empowered. There'll be many who don't want that, but I don't believe our civilization will survive unless everybody takes responsibility and starts to say what they feel, but in a way that's non-violent. I will never ever advocate for violence on any level with anyone because it just creates more and more problems, as we've seen already in the world. We are not creating peace. You might bully someone into yielding, but that's not resolution of a conflict. Those conflicts come up somewhere else in other allegiances, and we end up with a world where there's no holds barred. That's your Hobbesian worldview, that you create that. But if you really want a stable world order, you have to go towards a libertarian viewpoint. And this is not the left wing in politics that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a philosopher. Talking about John Locke's viewpoint in respect of the rule of law, having certain standards, inculcating within a society peaceful philosophies that do model respect and empathy for others, so that these conflicts can be not only avoided, but they won't even materialise if we are educated in a way that life is coming as a challenge to be overcome and also an opportunity to be realised. That there are no enemies, only friends in waiting when we open our hearts and our minds. So with that, I will leave it. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be cutting myself off all income soon, and I'm not going to go begging for food. I'm not. If the food comes, the food comes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I'm staying true to me, no matter what that means. I send you love and peace. Bye.